Good afternoon, guys. It's Gary Sly and the Legacy of Handmade Objects. It's a steamy Monday afternoon, June 23rd, here in beautiful Leesburg. I have been struggling, I say steamy because I've been struggling with the air conditioner repair folks for the last week. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if they came running through here at some point today. So if I have to stop the video and pick it back up again, I'll do that. I did want to try to get an episode in today anyhow, so that's kind of where we are. I wanted to talk some today about fibers. It's kind of been interesting to me, as you know, to look back and kind of explore the history of some of the different aspects of needlework, which we kind of take for granted. I mentioned a few weeks back that I had ordered a book on craft psychology, and it piqued my interest that the book was ordered from DMC, a popular company that we're all pretty familiar with. But I suspect if you're like me, you didn't know much about DMC, or don't know much about DMC, the company, and what it represents and what its history is. So I want to take a little time towards the end of today's video just to talk a little bit about that company, and in doing that, to suggest that all of the things that we take for granted today, the different types of fabric that we use, different kinds of fibers, dyes, so many of the things that we just pick up and go and use have a rich history. There's a book called Cotton that I've referred to a couple of times before. I can't figure out where my copy is now, so I must have loaned it out. But it's a fascinating look at how the fiber cotton has really changed the course of history in many ways. One example, of course, is the use of cotton here in the United States and the rich agricultural empire that was built by cotton in the South. Also using enslaved persons as part of the history of that tradition. India is also a place where cotton has had a great deal of influence. But I won't go too far down that road today. I'll just kind of review a little bit some of the fibers. Since I know that a lot of stitchers are self-taught, a lot of time we don't have a chance, unless we go to a store that has a big variety, we don't have a chance to know much about the variety that's available to us. And I find even though I own a shop, I'm always learning something new about fibers and fabrics and those sorts of things. So I thought what I would do first is just kind of review the different kinds of threads and yarns, just a little bit about yarn that I deal with here. And that's mostly stuff made from cotton. As I mentioned, DMC is going to be, I'm going to give you a little history lesson on DMC, but for what I see in my shop, it's the most commonly used fiber. DMC is short for Dolfos Mieg et Compagnie. And if your French is as bad as I am, you'll continue to call it DMC. And it's known by this horsehead logo, and there's a good bit in the history of the company about that. And what you're most likely to see when you're calling for DMC are the various colors of DMC, which are very wide-ranging and quite beautiful. I realize that not everybody uses DMC. Some folks are Anchor fans. I was interested to see, however, that DMC bought Anchor in 2023. So even if you use Anchor, you're still buying stuff from DMC. Sullivan is another one of the commonly used cotton threads outside of the hand-dyed categories that I'll talk to in a minute. So you're likely to see DMC in these skeins. It is sold sometimes in cones. These have to be special ordered, but if somebody's using a really large quantity, it's possible for us to get these in some colors. DMC also does pearl cotton, which is a thicker version of thread, usually not something that you strand, but which you use as it comes to you. 3s and 5s, those sizes are the ones most common for me here in the shop. And you'll also see that come in little balls like this. A lot of time needle pointers use pearl cotton, and you'll see it in some surface embroidery designs as well. DMC also makes a line of metallics, probably not as popular as some of the other things that we're likely to see, but they do have those. They have variegated threads. They have some new really soft fibers called Flosstube, and I'm sure there are many others that I'm not aware of. When I think about threads here in the shop, I'm also pretty aware of the fact that there are a lot of newer thread companies making cotton threads, often hand-dyed varieties. The one that I see the most and have the most sales for are Weeks Dye Works threads, and Weeks is also pretty well known for their hand-dyed fabrics as well. And I've carried Weeks Dye Works as the only hand-dyed fibers that I've had for quite some time. Recently, I've branched out into Classic Color Works, and so I have some of those. A couple of other varieties that you'll see. The Gentle Art does some threads, and these are particularly well known in the sampler world. There's a company called Color and Cotton, which has a whole variety of threads. You might be familiar with Cottage Garden threads out of Australia. I have a kit that came with some of those threads. And another really pretty version of threads is by a company named Caron, C-A-R-O-N. When we talk about metallics, Kreinik has always been kind of a standard for that, or at least in the time that I've been stitching. Kreinik was a company out of West Virginia that closed last year and sold out to another company and is still being produced and distributed that way. So a lot of time when you're looking at old patterns, all you're going to see are DMC colors and DMC threads. But many times when you look at new patterns and new designers and those who kind of branch out from that center standpoint, you'll see more of the hand-dyed fibers. And a lot of the hand-dyed stuff is variegated, which is kind of a nice twist to some of the patterns that we've seen in the past. Variegation in the past simply meant that parts of the threads had faded because we left them in the sun too long. But now that you can see variegation that's there on purpose, kind of like blue jeans that are pre-stained. The other thing I thought I would mention is that from a needlepoint standpoint, when we get into wools, my needlepoint wool of choice is pretty much always Persian Patternaean. These were produced for many years and then went out of business, and Colonial Needlework up in New York picked up those dyes and started creating it again, and I felt very lucky when I started getting Colonial Persian wools back in the shop, and you can find a nice variety of those for your needlepoint. Appleton is another of the needlepoint wool companies, and there have been quite a few down through the years. Some of those are not in business anymore, but there's been quite a variety of that. So there is a lot out there for folks to use. I haven't even talked about silks at all. I don't sell a lot of silks here, but I would use them all the time myself if they weren't so darned expensive. And they're wonderful and beautiful, and I'm sure you have seen some things done with silk fibers as well. Well, when we talk about DMC, I was surprised to know that DMC was founded in 1746 by a fellow named Jean-Henri Dollfus, and that's the first part of the name. That's the D in the DMC logo that I was talking about before. A later contributor to the company, a woman whose name was Migue, is where the M comes from, and in Campagny is the region of France where DMC gets started. They really got their start in the middle of the 18th century with printed fabrics. This is a time around the 1740s and moving forward when fabric began to be printed commercially. Before that, the weaving process is where the design would come in, and you did not necessarily have a process for dyeing designs onto fabric. A large jump in this came with technology that came from India, because, you know, British domination over India during that time was quite important. And you'll see, if you look closely at the history of DMC, that they did at one point have a factory in India and do quite a bit of work with printed fibers there. So it really was the creation of printed fabric that got DMC started. Eventually, it was a huge endeavor. Even as we look at it in the 20th century, at one point it employed as many as 30,000 people in the area of France where it was located. In the 1840s, you began to see the manufacture of the threads that we're more familiar with today when we hear the logo DMC. And it wasn't too long after that that the founder of that the current owners of DMC, not the founders at this point, met up with an Austrian embroidery designer named Therese de Delmont. And she had written a book, kind of an encyclopedia of embroidery stitches. It's in the 18th century that you really begin to see the commercialization of embroidery. You begin to see pattern books, you begin to see stamped items that people could embroider over top of. Obviously, embroidery and cross-stitch and those kind of skills had come forward quite a bit earlier than that. But it's a time in the middle of the 19th century when you really begin to see that take off. So that's when DMC became the kind of powerhouse company that we know today. It is true that you know, the kind of things that we do, the crafts and the things that we enjoy kind of had their ups and downs. And so following the turn of the century into the 20th century, you begin to see the emphasis on really fine handcraft, and the work that DMC had put out began to fade away. They closed their company in India. They began to phase out the work of printing fabric. And eventually you see them only focusing on the creation of dyed cotton threads. The company went into some really hard times in the 21st century. They went out of business for a while. They were eventually bought in 2019 by a British investment company. As consumers, I'm not sure we ever really saw much of this or had any sense that DMC was in any kind of trouble. But it was only in the last few years that they were bought out and saved from bankruptcy, else we wouldn't have had DMC at all. And as I mentioned earlier, in 2023, they bought the anchor thread empire, as you will, and began to take over that work at the same time. You know, I always love history, and I always love digging around and see what's there. But I think the reason I love it is because it helps to connect me with generations before. If you think about when this company began in the 1740s, even the creation of fibers was still fairly difficult. You're talking about right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Prior to that, if you wanted thread, it had to be spun on a spinning wheel. If you wanted fabric, it had to be woven on loom. So as that stuff begins to be mechanized, that's when you see a company like DMC take off and capitalize on the advantages of the Industrial Revolution. Well, sometimes today I think we find ourselves kind of reacting against that Industrial Revolution and maybe going back towards a love for more of the hand-dyed stuff. That's, I think, some of the reason why things like Weeks Dye Works and Classic Color Works and Gentle Arts are so popular with modern designers, is because there's a sense that to the extent that they are hand-dyed and created in a different way, that they take us back to some of the heritage and the legacy of stitching that we love so much. And you know, the variety that we have today, we're quite lucky to have that, but at its core is still that jump from everything being created by hand to the Industrial Revolution and what it brought forward. Even though these cotton threads that I've been talking about here are hand-dyed, they're still made through a mechanized process. So I hope I haven't wasted too much of your time today. I just thought it'd be kind of fun to look at these fibers, and the fact that I ordered a book from DMC reminded me that they've also had a very rich publishing history down through the years. They published patterns, stitch books. They did an encyclopedia on embroidery stitches at one point. And being smart business folks, as they have been through the years, they've created all sorts of things to pique our interest and make us want to buy their threads, and even before that, their fibers, their fabrics. So that's it for today, and it looks like I'm going to get through this whole broadcast without anybody interrupting me, but I'm afraid very soon the AC repairman is going to be back, and I'm going to have to figure out how to make all that work. But for now, that's it. It's Gary Sly, and it's the legacy of handmade objects.